all of you to Colombia and to New York if you're not from New York already. What I thought I would do is frame the day starting from the global perspective, because I know you'll end up in New York in the end, so maybe that's a fitting way to do things. The Columbia Water Center was set up about 3 years ago with the specific mission of looking at global water issues, or water as a global theme. And so what we've been doing is work more outside the United States in the last 3 years than we ever did before. And some work in New York and in the United States, but largely outside. So in terms of framing things from a global perspective, let me start with the general two areas that people talk about today. The first is water, energy, food. And the key issues that are being brought about here fall in line with the general globalization of everything in the world that's been going on for the last 20 or so years. The key thing that is worth bringing up for this audience out of that is that we invariably think of water as a very local thing. At best, we think about water as something a particular country should look at from a policy perspective or a development perspective, and we don't really think of water as a global issue. But if you realize that food is essentially the largest water consumer worldwide, and that food shortages on the global market, not in individual countries, but on the global market, lead to a very high price elasticity, you suddenly start realizing the connections that come with that. In some of the work that we've been doing recently, we find that if you look at about a 10% reduction in wheat or rice on the global market, that translates into a 90% increase in prices immediately. And that effect it declines, but it lasts for the subsequent 2 or 3 years. So that's the water-food connection at a global scale. And then if you look at energy, we see, as Bill pointed out, that the energy consumption for water is significant. The people who are interested in global climate change piggyback onto that story. But if you start looking at the way energy prices are going and are projected to go, you start seeing the sensitivity of local water resources, particularly treatment and distribution, that relate to energy prices. We also see the sensitivity of energy production to water resources. We have examples from the state of Kerala in India where thermal power plants that were proposed had to be scrapped because there were no cooling water sites available. And they were not quite sure that they were able to put up the investments on dry cooling technologies. From our work in India, I would like to share a couple of things. We have focused on 2 or 3 states in India so far, which are symbols of what is going on in that country and in China with regard to water resources. The essential story there is that we have a state called Punjab, which is the breadbasket of India, similar to northern China. And here we have groundwater decline sustained over the last 15 years at an average of 1 meter per year over a large area. We have a state called Gujarat, which is not a breadbasket state, but is a national food security mission district area, and there the declines are 3 meters per year. So the net of these stories is that you end up with a situation where 40 to 60% of total energy use in those states is going for simply pumping groundwater for agriculture. Okay? The depth from which farmers are pumping in the Punjab now has gone from 5 to 10 feet below surface to 300 feet below surface. In the case of Gujarat, they are at 300 meters below surface, and they are 100 kilometers from the ocean, and the static water levels are now 100 meters below sea level. So you can see that these situations are not tenable. What we find is that in part, this is because of the government's procurement strategies for specific grains, and in part because of state policies for giving free energy, or fixed cost energy but no marginal cost pricing. These are hard to change in a political setting. And at the same time, we find that the techniques that people are using for irrigation are some of the most wasteful around. And even very simple things that people could do are not in place. So what relevance does this have for somebody living in the United States? This is a local problem peculiar to India. The connection is that India, because of the population, and similarly China, are some of the world's largest consumers of the primary cereals. So if you look at this situation down into the future, and the total productivity is capped in these areas or reduced because of changes in climate plus depletion of groundwater resources, then the global supplies of those grains start getting constrained, and the trajectory we have had where real prices for grains in the past have been level or going down will be summarily changed. Combine that with the emphasis periodically on biofuels in the United States, and you end up with a very interesting mix of interaction between water and food and energy. I guess I forgot to mention that in these states in India, there are two interesting energy impacts that come from this. Since 40 to 60% of the energy is being used for groundwater pumping, what you find is that in Gujarat, the value of the energy generated is 1.5 times the net income of the farmer on a per acre basis. So you'd be better off just giving this person cash and saying forget it. Okay? In the other state in Punjab, the trajectory historically was that that was the place where industrialization, one of the centers of industrialization in India was happening. With unreliable electricity, people are forced to buy their own diesel generators and be subject to energy or regular petroleum-based generators or natural gas-based generators, and face an energy price which is roughly on average 3 times the regular grid price. You are not going to get industrialization on that basis. So the impact there is that the industrialization trajectory has ended. Okay. If you go to China, the situation is somewhat different, but China, being a much more tightly governed country, seems to have a strategy where they are noticing these problems, they are very concerned about them, and they seem to be moving on them. Whereas in India, much of the direction that you see is helter-skelter. There's a lot of talk, but there's not really any concerted action. So what comes from all this, I think, is that part of China's strategy in terms of agriculture and water seems to be to heavily start outsourcing those products from other countries, which again becomes a globalized issue. So what we are seeing in these areas is something which in the long time frame really looks like a global picture with water, and something that we will have to deal with as a global community. The second piece that I wanted to mention is the role of climate. There's been much said about climate change and the need to start adapting to it, and I think this is really good in the sense that it's promoting quite a bit of action in the energy water space towards increased efficiency. That's needed and it has to be done. But quite a bit of it is looking forward 30, 40, 50, 75 years on horizons which are inherently uncertain and are difficult to project. In the process of doing that, what we are losing sight of is that climate variability, or things that we have started to recognize which we didn't know 30 years ago, things that such as the fact that we have consistent, nearly periodic variations in climate that last 10, 20 years. So you have 10 or 20 wet years in a particular geography, followed by 10 or 20 dry years. These things pose as great a stress as the climate change projections that we put forward for the next 70 years or so. In fact, even in areas where we can be very confident about what the climate change scenarios will do in the long run, such as sea level rise, we find, looking at the historical data, that because of systematic changes in atmospheric pressure, for example, in the southern part of the North Atlantic or in the Pacific, we see fluctuations in sea level over periods of decades that are at the multi-10 centimeter scale, consistent with what kind of sea level rise projections that we make for climate change. So I think there is a time where in the water community we have to look more systematically at what past climate, paleoclimate going back 1,000 years can teach us, and what we have to do in the near term in terms of coming up with scenarios and predictions, as well as what we look at into the future. So I hope those two areas will be something that people will have a chance to think about in the context of both the nation and the New York City issues. And with that, I would like to pass on, and let's see if we can move forward with